Hello and welcome to another video. This will just be a very sort of brief video and also one that will be slightly off-brand for the channel. I don't really want to say off-brand when there is no brand established or not really any tradition that has been established for this channel. However, it's not, it's going to be a list video basically, and that's not really one that I've always sort of it's not really the type of video I see myself making. All that much. But I just thought it might be a nice idea because it is the holiday season. Many people are sort of observing Christmas and so forth, and really they are just indulging in some lovely, shameless commercialism, and consumerism, which is I very much indulge in, and not only at this type of year. So I don't want to seem I don't want to seem like I'm being moralizing or anything like that, because I absolutely love just buying books and everything like that. But nevertheless, I thought people are buying books, or they're looking for books to read potentially over the break, and I just thought, well, why not just sort of make a video on a few poets I feel are underrated or overlooked. Now, perhaps that sort of categorization might be a little bit contentious, because if you are Australian like me, you may well have heard of some of these poets. They're not all Australian, but the Australian ones I shall be discussing, particularly one of them, are reasonably well known here. They've sort of garnered a number of laurels and quite a lot of acclaim for their work. But internationally, they do seem sort of still quite underrated, unfortunately, which actually seems to be the case with a lot of great Australian authors generally. It takes them a very long time to break through, across the oceans, and that sometimes they actually never really break through. But yeah, I just thought, it's always great to celebrate poetry, and particularly overlooked or poets who I do think sort of deserve a little bit more of a spotlight, and who I just think are absolutely masterful. And it's just a shame that they are that they sort of they just haven't seemingly quite caught on yet to the degree that they certainly deserve. So basically, I'll just be providing very sort of quick summaries of the poets, and what I really like about them and so forth, and just displaying a few examples of their work, potentially even reading one or two lines from them. So that's basically just going to be it. So without further ado, I believe I have the first poet here, which I would say she is probably the most well-known out of all of these selections, which is the absolutely amazing Sarah Holland-Batt, the Australian poet. Here are two of her books right here, The Hazards and The Jaguar, or the Jaguar, as if you're American, or if you want to say it that way. These are just absolutely wonderful collections. I cannot recommend both of them enough. How did I discover Sarah Holland-Batt? I actually discovered her through just reading The New Yorker. Funnily enough, there's it is a fantastic magazine for discovering poets. It's not the only one. There's lots of other great magazines that you can subscribe to, or just peruse online. But I did discover her through a few of her poems which were published there. And then they just absolutely I was just sort of just blown away just by the sort of inventiveness of the language and sort of the control, the lineation. And yeah, I just thought, well, I have to read more. So I picked up the first collection I read, which I do actually think is, it's sort of hard to say what the best starting point is, but I would say that probably The Hazards, is a great starting point. The Jaguar is ostensibly more accessible, but I would say it's actually a very, very, it's a tough read. I was tearing up throughout this. It did hit quite hard, because it is about her viewing her father sort of decaying, and his body failing him due to sort of developing dementia and some, and just failing health in later life. And that hit quite hard, because I did have to watch as my own grandfather dealt with dementia, or Alzheimer's specifically for him, and that sort of decay. So even though it might seem a little bit more accessible, it is actually quite emotionally draining. So although, they're both wonderful collections, and they're pretty much just completely flawless throughout. I would actually recommend the Hazards just because there is a little bit more variety and I suppose sort of light in it. I mean, of course, there is also light in this just through the sort of scintillating or brilliant nature of the lines themselves, and also through some poems that do ultimately look at how life, you do need to celebrate it when you are in sort of the when you are enjoying it, in your sort of prime or your prime ages, or just even at any point in your life, really, and just cherishing every moment. But the reason I'd really recommend the Hazards is because there's an amazing versatility on display here, just thematically, and also sort of the disciplines. It's very interdisciplinary in what it discusses. There's some fantastic sort of metaphors that are mined from music, and also just from nature. Holland-Batt has seemingly just an incredible knowledge, encyclopedic knowledge even, of music and also of nature. There's an amazing sort of lushness throughout both of these collections, just through the sort of this cascade of even just taxonomy, really, or just naming various flora and fauna, particularly flora. And you just sort of get this sense of lushness and just a real vibrancy that, it does make the world feel more textured, and also just sort of more, just sort of throbbing with life when you do go and return to it after reading some of these poems. I also would just say that both of these really, and this will be a common trait across all of these poets, is they really just demonstrate a mastery with enjambment. In terms of, I probably should have said this at the very beginning of the video, just as a sort of, criteria I might use for how I really, for the poetry I like, and how I sort of find value in it, is that, whenever I'm writing poetry or myself, is that I've sort of realized I don't have the knack, I just don't have the ability to sort of, write in meter, or, or to like a sort of rhyme scheme or anything like that. And so I've sort of realized, at least in the sort of blank verse era that we're living in, or, the free verse era that we're living in, and have been for some time, that really enjambment is really what is key for me in poetry. And it's, it's just absolutely amazing how Holland-Batt and also all of these poets are able just to draw out so many different images, not just one image, but actually this sort of array, or these sort of this almost sort of I don't want to make this too sort of wanky or academic, but rhizomatic sort of images, a bit like Deleuze, just to use that sort of image of the the rhizome, rather than sort of going up and being sort of rigid. It just sort of these images are sort of spread out infinitely, and in sort of in sort of very unpredictable ways, and just sort of very surprising ways. I should also just quickly say that not only is it music and nature that are invoked by Holland-Batt, but also painting in a really interesting way. And so you just get this sense of sort of not only lushness from the nature, but you also get sort of this incredible just lushness from just sort of the sheer amount of various disciplines that are being sort of invoked. And also just these amazing parallels that are being identified across all of them. One other thing I would also say about the Hazards that I particularly like, although it is also common to the Jaguar, just to a slightly lesser degree, is that there's also this amazing international sense to it, that it's not just it's not really just Australian poetry, but it's a poet who happens to be Australian, and it goes all across the world, really, which again also just helps with a sense of lushness and just this sort of surprising and invigorating interconnectivity between everything. It's absolutely wonderful when you get poets who really sort of zoom in to a micro level locally, but it's also quite wonderful when you get these sort of poets who reflect a sort of interconnected world, a globalized world. It's just it's quite exciting just to read sort of poetry that is sort of that isn't a more her voice is slightly classical in a way, but that you sort of have this voice that is somewhat familiar, but then also that is just assuming a sort of global perspective that, of course, the poets of old just couldn't. The only thing I would say, just as a, I guess just a sort of caveat emptor, is just absolutely do perhaps have a dictionary at your side, or just be willing just to look up a lot of words, because I know when I was reading these, my vocab isn't great, but I do know that when I was reading these, I was constantly finding new words, absolutely brilliant words, or sort of new terms, again, for a lot of these plants that I just wasn't familiar with, all these musical terms, or just even certain adjectives and so forth. But yeah, just an absolutely wonderful, wonderful sort of display of artistic mastery. So staying with the Australian poets, or staying on the Australian continent, this is Blakwork by Alison Whittaker. Now, I actually discovered Alison Whittaker because just by chance, I ended up selecting her poem, A Love Like Dorothea's, which I would say is probably the highlight of this collection. It does fall quite early on, but the whole collection is wonderful. But I ended up selecting that just after I read it, because it was a weekly text on one of my creative writing courses, and I just thought it was absolutely extraordinary. Certainly one of the most sort of formally innovative works I'd read. Just to give you an idea, the form is just sort of the page format is sort of going nuts in a lot of these texts. Actually, here's A Love Like Dorothea's, and this is what I thought was absolutely brilliant. So it's a reflection on Dorothea Mackellar, who is a very famous Australian poet, who kind of wrote, I guess, like one of the texts of, sort of the Australian national identity. But of course, it is, I hadn't really properly considered just how problematic some of those texts are that she did produce. And this is a brilliant and very evocative reflection, not just a great sort of critical analysis, but also a very brilliant visceral analysis of how this sort of, this melancholia and this horror that can be inspired by this feeling of sort of not owning one's own home. I should say Alison Whittaker is an Indigenous poet. And so a lot of this, and also the title Blakwork, of course, BLAK, which is sort of again, you may not be familiar if you're from overseas, but that's sort of like the adjective or just the description that is attached to a lot of Indigenous artworks. That, the Indigenous artists attach their own works, and they sort of, use it as a sort of title of pride. What's absolutely brilliant is that it is a reflection on landscape, and it is literally written or presented in landscape as a format. So there's this sort of beautiful, just ingenious sort of formal pun that is being forwarded here. And it's also really just revealing how, the text, the entirety of the book is actually its own sort of geography, and that it also influences the external geography. Of course, if you read a poem about the landscape, it's going to potentially, particularly one like the Dorothea Mackellar one that's sort of being referenced and deconstructed here, is that if you read a poem like that, it is going to influence how you see the landscape around you. So what you get throughout this is there's obviously a lot of really interesting post-colonial literature out there, but what I really like about this one is that not only is it intellectually, on the intellectual level, brilliant. Well, of course, everything is, any good poem is always going to be very intellectually accomplished, but not only do you get this sort of brilliant intellectual takedown and reflections upon this sort of contested space, and also often these sort of hidden traumas or hidden bruising that can occur through how text represents space, particularly the white sort of gaze or the colonial gaze, is that you also just have these, it's just so beautiful and evocative on an emotional level. And I also love sort of talking about how Holland-Batt has an international perspective. This is very, very much embedded within the Australian landscape. But it does have this wonderful modern edge to it. There's some really, really sort of just interesting. You almost have poems that sort of evoke. There is actually a poem in here sort of looking at a data center, but you have poems that do evoke sort of scrolling through data, which I know other poets have done, and actually I was sort of inspired by that. Not just this work, but a few of those poems sort of relating to that. to actually even write one poem myself based around that. There's also sort of interesting reflections you get on Twitter, like there's one, "Don't at me." There's also a great sense of dry humor throughout this and sort of, very, very biting, sardonic tone. I think this was the first poem, this one that made me, this is a poem entirely written in emojis, which, that might sound a little bit cringy, but it is actually quite well done here, particularly in the context of the entire work. And that was pretty revelatory for me when I first encountered it. So I think if you're actually starting out as a poet, well, I said, like, I'm a long way down the line. I've only been really writing poetry for about 4 years properly now, 5 years properly now. But if you are sort of just starting out and you sort of want to just get ideas about what is possible in the text, I would absolutely recommend this. So now shifting continents, now moving to North America to discuss one of the most recent discoveries of this year, and actually one I discovered via r/poetry on Reddit. Not actually because one of his poems was shared on there, but just there was a comment. I believe, yeah, it would have been r/poetry, or maybe it was on TrueLit, and someone was just like basically just saying really great modern poets, and I'm going to go and try and find that so I can link just that user just to credit them, because they basically listed about 6 poets, 4 of which I've just absolutely fallen in love with, but unfortunately 3 of them I just feel like I haven't read enough of their work yet to really be able to say enough. But the next underrated poet is none other than Donald Revell. Now, I can't believe that I've never actually heard of this poet, because even though I'm not that well read, I do sort of try and keep up with people, sort of figures. I do try and keep up with figures in the literary scene, and just ones who've been around for a while. And he has published just a plethora of various collections. This is probably I think this is the earliest one I own, Erasures, which came out in the 90s, 92, yeah. But I just don't understand how he's flown so under the radar, because his enjambment and his imagery is, they're just absolutely next level. Like I was sort of saying with Sarah Holland-Batt, you have this really, really surprising use of enjambment throughout. You're constantly surprised line by line. And also what I love about Revell is that there's this sort of, actually a lot of his later collections, such as suggested by the cover of this one or the Bitter Withy cover here, is that actually he seems to be quite influenced by Christian thought specifically. I'm not religious. I guess you call me an agnostic theist. I sort of believe that there could be some sort of God, but I'm not into organized religion. But you do sort of get this sense of even if you're not aligned with his particular viewpoint or his spiritual sort of beliefs, you do get this sort of amazing sense of almost sort of like they're almost sort of like religious experiences reading some of these poems, because like with I always think about Paul Schrader's transcendental style, that film theory about how sort of when you remove certain things or you strip poems back, and then you suddenly have this a brief moment where it's sort of you get this sort of this explosion of emotion. Some of these poems almost remind me of that, where you have this very, very stripped back, minimalist style, very restrained, very controlled, but then you suddenly get either just through a surprising line that just sort of sideswipes you, or through sort of an ending that sort of almost like a Volta you might get, where there's this sort of change in subject or perspective, or sort of a surprising, surprising conclusion where there's almost sort of this item that's been on the periphery that suddenly becomes the central image of the poem. Or you actually just get, just this sudden sort of more sort of clear admission after these sort of more restrained and sometimes even slightly abstract lines. Not loose, but, sort of just a little bit ambiguous in their phrasing. And so, yeah, it almost does remind me of that transcendental style a little bit, where you do actually get this sense of sort of transcendence, but there's also that wonderful sense of mystery to it, that, not everything is being completely revealed, that you have undergone some sort of change, but you're not exactly sure what sort of change that is or why it has occurred. But what is wonderful is that you do know, again, if you go back and read them again and again, these do reward rereading a lot of Revell's poems. is that, you know, you can actually slowly sort of unpack what has occurred. Even if maybe 10% of it does remain a little bit elusive, it sort of reminds me of the best poems of John Ashbery in that way, that, you know, there's always something a little bit out of reach, but there's also so many just brilliant things that you actually, that, you know, that are obtainable and, you know, that are just so enriching once you actually do sort of uncover them. Through each of the poems. I should also just say, again, just a really, really controlled use of form. There's some, you know, I think I haven't actually, I should say, I haven't actually read the entirety of these collections. I've been reading through them slowly because I've discovered, I've just been reading through his poems on the Poetry Foundation site. But basically, there's some really, really interesting uses of even just stanza structure and how they sort of create, you know, certain effects. I don't actually know if it's in one of these collections. I haven't seen it yet. But there's a really, really fantastic poem called Birds Small Enough. And for example, in that, there's a use of couplets. And they almost sort of, how they sort of appear throughout is they almost create this sort of sense of wings, like the wings of the bird, and this sort of sense of flight. And in that poem, there's a lack of punctuation that's sort of, there's this lack of punctuation that's one of the key devices, and again that creates a sort of sense of flight or sort of fluid associations, and a sort of very sort of freeing looseness, not looseness to the language, but a loose feel to the lines. And again, it's just this, again, that sort of just helps with the, you know, the poems becoming experiential, not just, you know, to repeat the cliched phrase, but it is a good one, you know, they really show and they don't just tell. So yeah, I absolutely cannot recommend Donald Revell enough. It does seem like, unfortunately, I had to find this one on, through a sort of a independent bookstore on Abe Books. Abe Books can be all right, but it does require a sort of lot of independent research. I wouldn't actually ultimately, you know, say, if you can find it on eBay or something, or just through like your local bookstore, then I'd absolutely try that. But I think there are a few copies up on Abe Books, but just make sure, you know, like the sellers are legit and they're not like sort of scam artists, I should say, because it does seem like sometimes on that site that you can get people with decent scores, but, you know, or decent ratings rather, but they're actually, you know, if you go and Google them independently, it looks like they either have bad reviews on their eBay site or that, you know, they actually don't really have all that much of a presence online. So I always recommend, if you're going through Abe Books, make sure that you're actually buying through a bookstore or, you know, at least some sort of outlet, rather than just, you know, any random sort of user. But yeah, do try and track down one of those. But in terms of the newer works, these, I actually just got them through the Alice James website, which I hadn't really heard of before, but it seems like an absolutely wonderful poetry publication of a lot of really interesting poets. So yeah, I'd recommend just going onto their site if you want to try one of these collections out. Again, I haven't read them in full, so unfortunately I can't say you know, which one I'd ultimately recommend. Outside of the fact that it seems like his most recent ones are mainly all based around spirituality, whereas something like Erasures, some of his earlier work, seems a little bit more focused you know, it is spiritual still. Actually, funnily enough, I just remember there is actually a John Ashbery quote on the back of the on the blurb, so it's quite fitting that I mentioned Ashbery earlier. But yeah, these early collections seem a little bit more politically minded, and a little bit, they are spiritual, but more in the sense of these sort of American mythos, if that makes sense. You see a lot of sort of references to Vietnam and so forth, and, you know, and sort of the, you know, and you know, engaging with sort of media, you know, like the sort of, this sort of muse of the sort of oracle of the television. So yeah, and last but not least, sticking with the continent of North America and the country of the United States of America, well, you know, the states of America, really, I'm not sure how united they are, is Thylias Moss. Now, Thylias Moss would have to be, along with Sylvia Plath and Wallace Stevens, probably the most formative poet I've ever encountered on my own sort of poetry, because I do sometimes write poetry in my spare time. Oh, well, I say my spare time, but I guess all my time is sort of spare time. But anyway, Thylias Moss is absolutely, I think, just one of the greatest poets to ever really live, at least in the last 100 years. From just, you know, again, I'm not that well read, but that is a big statement. But, you know, even from just, you know, just from a survey of, you know, of a lot of very canonized and famous poets. You know, I just think she really often just outdoes outperforms so many of them. And it's actually, I just think it's such a shame as well that, you know, just her level of brilliance, that she is overlooked. And it's sad because she's even overlooked really in the sort of, again, it's not a canon I know all that well, but the sort of the canon of the, you know, of Black American writers. She doesn't really seem to crop up as much. You know, you always get Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison, you know, or even a more modern poet like Claudia Rankine. Claudia Rankine is absolutely a master and just brilliant as well. So I'm absolutely not diminishing the stature of any of those aforementioned writers. But I am just saying that it is a shame that Thylias Moss has not sort of been absorbed into that. Funnily enough, I was introduced to her when I was watching an interview with Harold Bloom. And I must say, I'm very grateful, that Harold Bloom did mention her, because it led me to read a lot of her poetry online where it's available. But I must say, Harold Bloom, God bless him, an absolutely brilliant academic, and amazing discipline with his work. But I don't actually think the way he mentioned Moss was, fully always in good faith. It wasn't fully in good faith, because he was sort of being questioned quite rightfully about, or quite rightly, about his idea of the Western canon, or just the canon of literature generally, and how it was unfortunately very skewed towards white writers, and white men, and he did throw out Thylias Moss's name because he apparently didn't like Toni Morrison as a writer all that much. And so I did feel, maybe it was like sort of, it was unfortunately sort of tainted by that sort of deflection, or that sense of deflection. But nevertheless, I'm very glad I discovered her through Harold Bloom. And it is quite, I guess that's sort of almost a good segue, because she is a Black writer, and she is writing about an experience that is very, very much alien to me, and it's one that, although however much I read about it, I'll never be able to sort of on a posteriori level actually be able to really feel it. That sort of constant sort of and like Whittaker as well, I should say, Alison Whittaker. That it's not one I'll ever be able to properly embody. That sort of paranoia, that pain. But it is still, of course, crucial to read about. And I think the way that Moss writes about it is just fascinating. This collection, Pyramid of Bone, is, I think, flawless. It's another one. It's almost a collection. I guess it's sort of almost chapbook in size, but it's absolutely worth seeking out. It's very hard to find. In fact, unfortunately, a lot of her collections seem very expensive. I've been trying to look for a copy of Tokyo Butter, and it's just exorbitant sort of prices, and ones I'm not wanting to pay, or willing to pay, because it would just be contributing to sort of exorbitant and high prices for other people, and it's certainly just a waste of money to do that, no matter how brilliant the poetry may be. But Pyramid of Bone, if you can find this, I would absolutely recommend it. It's a very brief but extremely dense work. The reason I love Moss so much is that like with all these sort of poets I've discussed, is that she although it is slightly different, but she has these amazing sort of surprising connections she can draw, and that line by line you have these incredible, this almost like a stratum of like layered images, or sort of like a hallway of overlaid images, sort of those rhizomatic associations I was talking about that are created through the enjambment, where one image is suspended, and so you have that imprinted on your mind, and then the next line comes in and it actually complicates that previous image, and then creates a new one by sort of introducing a new detail to it, or and so forth. But outside of those amazing sort of associations, I should say, with the associations, is that what's really interesting is it almost reminded me of sort of like a montage where there's sort of match cuts throughout a movie, like where they're sort of dissolving onto one another. And so it just creates this sense of brilliant sort of fluidity. And just, it really does sort of stimulate your own thinking. It really sort of, by interrogating a lot of these subjects, how it sort of represents Black figures or non-white sort of just profiles on the page, is that it really does sort of make you, it sort of activates you intellectually, and just really makes you look at literature in often a new way. and question it a lot more closely, not just looking at the traditional techniques, but also sort of the effects that they can have, and sort of how perspective itself can have effects on reality. I would also say the other thing that stuck out to Moss that was very influential on me when I was just sort of figuring out exactly what to do with writing. I mean, I'm not an expert in it by any means. Poetry is maybe the one. No, poetry. Sorry, it's not maybe. It's absolutely the one medium that I feel like I have any sort of level of expertise in. But I'm not an expert. But I mean, it's the one that I feel like I understand the most. Whereas, like, short stories and film, it's just sort of, I'm just an admirer of them. I don't really think, I have all that much sort of proper understanding of them. But what I realized with reading this was this sort of really interesting device, or what I discovered through reading this was this really interesting device that I'd almost call like the sort of the Moss double down, which is that she'll end the line with this brutal, with this brutality, just this really stinging sort of, nettling sort of line or idea. And then you think, oh, well, all this sort of brutal criticism, really trenchant criticism of someone, or really, a sort of more sort of convention. And you think, oh, well, that's it. There's no way. And then the next line will just come in and just be like a second punch. And it's really interesting as a use of enjambment that not just only is it sort of creating sort of these myriad images, that you can sort of that are sort of imprinted on your mind, and that you then they sort of lie there, and then you sort of reflect on them. Is that there's also this real sense of just anger, palpable anger that comes out through this, and it's actually quite hard, I think, to do anger well. In that it's, and also to sort of keep it in check. I mean, of course, any sort of black writer, I understand when they have like just an extreme anger, it's completely justified. But I do also think even like female writers, when they're talking about misogyny and so forth, it's very, very much understandable how that sort of anger can almost overtake the text. You can't really blame them for it at all, because the world has still is, and has for a long time been, forever really been, an awful place for minorities and women. But it's really wonderful how Moss is able to convey, a high degree of anger, but also then keep sort of formal invention and formal control, not allowing herself to be sort of swallowed up by this anger, but then, sort of converting it into this sort of generative, constructive force. It's just really quite amazing. I would highly, highly recommend this. This is just a brilliant book, Pyramid of Bone, Thylias Moss. And I actually haven't read this yet, but I did manage to find a copy of a later collection of hers, Wannabe Hoochie Mama, Gallery of Realities, Red Dress Code. That's quite the title. And oh my goodness, I actually read this, but Harold Bloom is on the back as well. So there you go, Harold Bloom cropping up once again, and Charles Simic is on here as well. So so a lot of so quite some big names there praising Moss. But yeah, I just think it's a shame that she hasn't that she seemingly, it's even hard to find a lot of her stuff online. You can find a lot of the work in Pyramid of Bone is available. A lot of the poems in Pyramid of Bone are available through the Poetry Foundation, but unfortunately, I don't know. I just don't know why she hasn't really been recognised, I think, to the degree that she really deserves. So hopefully that was an enjoyable video, and hopefully I've introduced you to potentially to some writers that you might seek out, and even if you don't like them, hopefully they give you something to think about, or at least a nice, sort of, well, not necessarily nice, but a sort of powerful or lasting image, or just even a great, just a single line if you do read one of their poems, just as a sort of sample of their work. As I said, I probably won't be doing too many list videos, but if you did enjoy this, then let me know, because I might maybe then do a few more, although, as I said, I think I lack the expertise to really be making list videos, although that doesn't really seem to stop half the internet. Anyway, thank you for your time, and have a wonderful holiday season. I actually tried to wear a sort of semi, holiday sort of, it's not a holiday, but a sort of festive shirt, with a bit of pink and red in it, and a bit of white, a sort of candy cane sort of color. I hope you have a lovely holiday season, and a happy New Year. I hope I hope the New Year is certainly happier. Because right now it's quite chaotic around the world, but Yeah, anyway, thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you in the next video. Oh, and I should apologize. I'll try and stop filming stuff at around sunset. I got a little bit ambitious with this video, thinking I could maybe make it shorter, at least the recording. And it looks like that hasn't really occurred. So I had all the lighting set up for sort of, late afternoon. We're on daylight saving at the moment in Australia, so it is quite light until a late, late in the evening. It's close to 7 o'clock here now, I think, and it's still pretty light. But yeah, I'll try and record things a little bit early, just so that I'm not in. The lighting is a little bit better. But yeah. Anyway, thank you again for your time, and I'd love to hear any sort of poetry recommendations in the comments, if you have any, or thoughts on the poets I've discussed. So bye.